More specifically, Christianity means these two varieties of Christianity. So when I say that Christianity is a power and that it brings with it recognition, okay, recognition by whom? Recognition by the Franks coming from the West, or recognition from the Byzantines coming from the South. As you know, the Franks and the Byzantines have two different accounts of what happened to the Roman Empire. It fell and we rebuilt it, very beautiful, that's the Franks. Or it never fell, we are it, also very beautiful, that's the Byzantines. So these are two relationships to the classical world, and but more importantly, these are two powers that are moving into Eastern Europe. The Franks, so let's get some more detail about this. The great leader of the Franks, so this is not a course in French history, but you'll find that we have to talk about because France, frankly, was very important. Okay, so we will keep coming back to things that happened in what's now France and Germany, because France and Germany are very important. The turning point here, the coronation of Charlemagne as king of the Franks on Christmas Day of the year 800. Very easy to, he calls it the Renovatio Imperii. He calls it the restoration of empire. Christmas Day 800. Charlemagne just means Charles the Great. And incidentally, the word Charles, so there's now another king called Charles, right? Am I up on my news? So the word Charles in Slavic languages, well, how do you say like Charles in a Slavic language? Any Slavic language? Karol. Karol is good. Okay, so that name Charles becomes the Slavic word, or a Slavic word for king. Which is, I mean, that's kind of impressive, right? Like, I mean, that's the sort of thing, like, if you were a rapper, you would want your name to become the word for king, right? And I'm just going to say now, no rapper is ever going to achieve that, right? I mean, no rapper is ever going to outdo Charlemagne on this front, I don't think. Okay, I mean, I'm happy to have that prediction on tape. So Charles in French, Charles becomes Karel or Karol in Slavic languages, which is the word for king. In Polish, it's król, Ukrainian korol. So the very idea of kingship is coming from this kingdom of the Franks established in 800. And it is a new model state. It's the model state which is then going to prevail in Europe, very importantly, where the king accepts that he is a Christian ruler, and he accepts, for example, that he can be crowned by a pope, but he's not subordinate to the pope. Whereas in the South, in Byzantium, the idea of kingship is going to be very different. The idea is that the secular ruler and the religious power are very much in alignment. We'll return to that. So the word for ruler in much of Eastern Europe is Tsar, which comes from Caesar, right, which comes from Rome. That's the Byzantine tradition. So that the very words that you have for the supreme leader in a political system are coming from these two rival powers. Okay, so what can we say about the South? We've already said a lot of it. Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, capital in Constantinople, which is today Istanbul. There's a song by They Might Be Giants about that, which I'm sure those of you who are into oldies know. It's been the capital of the Roman Empire since the 4th century. From the point of view of Byzantium, there's an unbroken succession of legitimate Roman emperors the entire time. They refer to themselves as the Romans. They do so speaking Greek. That's Byzantium. That city, Constantinople, is unparalleled in the Europe of the time. It's 10, 20, 30 times bigger than it's, compared to, it's 30 times bigger than Paris. It has, we don't know exactly how big, but maybe something like 1 million people, a tremendous scale of a city for the time, and gloriously beautiful in a way which no European city can vaguely think of rivaling. And still worth a visit, by the way. Still lovely, Istanbul, worth a visit. I was there on my honeymoon, it was worth it. Okay, so the differences between the Franks and the Byzantines. We've listed several of them. 2 claims to the Roman inheritance, right? 2 varieties of Christianity, although the theology is not so important. 2 different relationships between state and secular power, where in Byzantium state and religious power, state and spiritual power are much more carefully lined up. two relationships between lords and vassals. In the Frankish political tradition, the vassals are going to be lined up in something which we think of as a feudal system, where they have the right to property and have a certain amount of autonomy. That is going to be less true in Byzantium. But both of them are in Europe, and both of them are in a Europe which is pushing into the pagan world. There are the Scandinavians to be converted, there are the Celts to be converted, and there are the Slavs to be converted. The Celts, the Scots, the Irish, they're out of reach of Byzantium. The Scandinavians, it turns out, are also out of reach of Byzantium, except for the Scandinavians who travel to Kiev, which we're going to get to. But the Slavs are not out of reach, and the Slavs are the biggest group, the Slavs are the biggest prize, and the Slavs are an object of direct and explicit competition between these two powers. The Byzantium is already there with its missionary activity. We mentioned Cyril and Methodius. That's an example of missionary activity from Byzantium. The Franks set up an archbishopric in the German city of Magdeburg in 962. And that is a kind of outpost of missionary activity. So when you think of these archbishoprics, so the way that the Christian church in the West is set up, there are bishops, and the Bishop of Rome is the highest bishop, and he's known as the Pope, right? Underneath the Pope, there are archbishops who have territory. Underneath the archbishops, they're bishops, and they have territory. Underneath the bishops, they're priests, and the priests have territory, and that territory is known as a parish. It's all beautifully organized. But when you think of these archbishoprics, you should be thinking of imperial expansion too. Magdeburg is about imperial expansion to the west, and Bremen, by the way, is about imperial expansion to the north. So when the German speakers are trying to convert the Scandinavians, they're doing it from Bremen. In the meantime, people are also trying to convert the Scandinavians from England. But the Scandinavians are out of reach. I just mentioned this as another example. It's also a nice place to visit. The Scandinavians are out of reach, but the Slavs are not. Okay. This all hooks together. It all connects. When everyone, if you try to think like, what is the one thing which causes this? Things are always connecting, right? So if I say, what does religion have to do with it? Well, religion has to do with creating a state, but it also has to do with not being enslaved, and eventually it has to do with what people actually believe, and these things are all connected. If I say at this part of the lecture, what do the Vikings have to do with it? The Vikings come in to the history of both the Franks and the Byzantines, right? Because this period that we're talking about is the Viking Age. The Viking Age begins in 793. That's when the Vikings first make themselves known. And usually if you say the Viking Age, it's like now we cut to a completely different movie, right? We forget everything else. It's just the wooden ships with their beautiful brows and the burly men and the beards and the horns and the throwing the spears over the enemy, which probably is a myth, and the berserker thing, which is also probably a myth. But we're cutting to a completely different story, right? And that's what we can't do, because the Viking Age is happening simultaneously with the expansion of the Franks and with the expansion of the Byzantines, and it's related to these two things. It is the expansion of the Franks which probably provokes the Vikings to test out their own naval technology by plundering the Franks. And then realizing they can do this, they can get down rivers, they can do interesting things, they can also go out to sea and do interesting things. So the Vikings are probably best understood as a reaction to Charlemagne. And in their reaction, as they realize that there are an awful lot of rivers they could go down in Europe, and there's an awful lot that could be plundered, or looking at it more sympathetically, trade routes to be established, this brings them to Eastern Europe and to Byzantium. And I know you guys are wondering why I keep obsessing about the mountains and the rivers and all these things that don't matter anymore because the internet, I know. But you can't figure out what the Vikings are up to without knowing where the rivers are. The Vikings are trying to get from north to south because they're trying to make a huge amount of money. There's a lot of silver down there with the Arabs, and they can get that silver and they can bury it in big hoards, which is what they like to do for mysterious reasons. It's really great for archaeologists and for historians because we can say, okay, look, here is a hoard of coins which were clearly minted in an Arab-speaking place at this time, but look, it's in northwestern Russia. And how do we explain that? And we explain it with the Vikings, right?